I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
And now, two pigeons who can't believe how good humans have it with DirecTV.
These humans are hopping from streaming apps to live sports without batting a wing.
All from the DirecTV home screen.
With just one click, you could be watching a baseball game, a movie on Netflix,
or a critically acclaimed documentary.
You watch documentaries?
I love the ones that leave you with a question.
What?
Exactly.
DirecTV, a better way to watch whatever you want to watch. Visit DirecTV.com.
Internet-connected Gemini device, separate Netflix membership, and additional paid subscriptions required for third-party apps.
At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile. Built for tomorrow's emergencies. Ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
Hello, mega orderers. You are very lucky, as today you are going to get the edited audio of our second ever Disorder live show. This one was live at the Frontline Club on Friday, March 21. Since then, Russian and American officials have met in Saudi Arabia to discuss a ceasefire in the Russo-Ukrainian war. Unsurprisingly, very little progress has been achieved. The Kremlin has done its standard tactic of creating a problem, and this is about energy and electricity issues, and then making a price for solving that problem and saying, oh, we can't deal with a ceasefire, but we can deal with the Black Sea grain deal, or we can deal with the issue of bombing the electricity grid, which of course isn't a ceasefire, let alone a peace agreement, which is what the Trump administration claimed that these talks are about. So if you're interested in, is Trump actually trying to make peace in Ukraine? Have Western sanctions worked? What's going on in the front line of that war? Well, we're going to go back to last week's event, live Disorder podcast at the Frontline Club, and hear about all these themes. Welcome to the Frontline Club, and I'm going to be the host, and it's my great pleasure and honor to be joined by two of my absolutely favorite former Disorder guests, and I promise that they're my favorites not because of the random coincidence of the similarity of our accents, but rather because of the content of their ideas. First, allow me to introduce Sir Bill Browder, a successful investor, globally acclaimed author, famous philanthropist, and humanitarian advocate. Browder's tireless advocacy for holding dictators and their henchmen to account is widely known. He was a guest on the Disorder podcast episodes 104, which is quite recent, and 26, way back in the beginning. And his books, Red Notice and Freezing Order, are core texts if you want to understand how corruption, autocracy, and disorder are all interconnected. And sadly, they're extremely relevant because those three things are more interconnected than ever. Stephanie Baker is a multi-award-winning investigative journalist and author of a recent book that I really love, Punishing Putin: Inside the Global Economic War to Bring Down Russia. Before joining Bloomberg, Stephanie worked as a reporter for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Prague, and the Moscow Times. I consider Stephanie the world's leading expert on the West's economic war against Russia. What has worked, what has not worked, and why. It will not surprise you to know that if this question interests you at all, I strongly recommend episode 75 of Disorder featuring her. To kick off the discussion, I want to understand, where are we at? It is the evening of March 21st. So these are the questions that are on my mind. Is the Kursk salient being closed? Is Russia regaining the Ukrainian occupied Russian territory? What of yesterday's and today's Ukrainian attacks on the Russian base? What of Russian drone strikes on Odessa when the Czech president was visiting? And now, most crucially, since January 20, we've had all this talk about a supposed ceasefire or peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. Is any of that real? Has anything been achieved? And have Trump, Vance's, and Witkoff's erratic and distasteful bullying of the West's genuine Ukrainian ally and cozying up to Russia, has that yielded anything concrete for American strategic interests, European engagement, or Ukrainian security? And lastly, has Zelensky managed to undo the damage from the Oval Office ambushing with his subsequent, apparently very convivial phone calls with Trump? Sir Bill, tell us your thoughts.
Well, that's like 9 questions.
Where are we? Where are we?
Well, I think that the most important issue is this war. Everyone always asks me, when is this war going to end? What's the end game? How is it all going to end? Et cetera. And of course, everyone wants it to end. They wanted it to end quickly. It didn't end. They wanted it to end when Trump came in. This war is only going on for one reason and one reason only. And that is that Vladimir Putin decided to invade Ukraine. He is the singular cause of the war, and he would be the singular cause to end the war if he chose to do so. And so we're sitting here watching Donald Trump show up. I should say, even before he showed up, he said, I'm going to end this thing in 24 hours. He's now showed up. And so how does he end this war in 24 hours or 6 months or any period of time? There are 2 parties to the war. There's the invading party that started the war, Russia, and then there's the defending party, Ukraine. And Vladimir Putin has put enormous pressure on Ukraine, who are just defending themselves, and put no pressure on Putin, who's attacking. And so it seems to me only Putin can end this war. And then we have to ask ourselves, why is Putin at war? And my answer is probably different than other people's answers, but I don't think this war has anything to do with NATO. I don't think this war has anything to do with gaining territory. Actually, if you've ever looked at a map of Russia, it's so big, it's unbelievable. What do they need a little extra territory for? I don't think it has anything to do with that. I think this war comes down to one simple thing, which is that Putin went into government, at least at the beginning, to steal money. And by the way, everybody in Russia who goes into government goes to steal money. There's no person that goes because they want to serve the people of Russia. They go in to steal money. And over a period of time, Putin and about 1,000 people around him have stolen $1 trillion from the Russian state. $1,000 billion. And that's money that should have been spent on public services, on healthcare, on education, on roads. Instead, it was spent on private jets and yachts and villas in the south of France. And I think that Putin came to understand that at some point, the 141 million Russians that aren't participating in this whole kleptocracy bonanza, at some point, something will happen. And he doesn't know what will happen, but something will happen. And it happens in a lot of different places in these situations where some event takes place and all of a sudden there's 1 million people with pitchforks on Red Square. And he can kill Alexei Navalny, he can kill Boris Nemtsov, but he can't kill 1 million people on Red Square. And that's what he's afraid of. And so what do you do if you're afraid of 1 million people with pitchforks on Red Square? You create a foreign enemy and you start a war. And so that they're not mad at you, they're mad at a foreign enemy. And so if you look at Russia versus Ukraine, I mean, there is no beef between these people. They're intermarried. They all roughly can communicate with each other. They're more or less the same religious faith. They look the same. He created a fake war in order to create a foreign enemy, in order to distract the Russian people. And the reason why that this is such a pessimistic analysis that I have is that it means there's nothing that Trump can do that's going to make Putin happy. There's nothing Trump can give Putin that will make him less afraid of the people who he's afraid of, which are his own people. And therefore, Putin is going to do all sorts of tricks and rope-a-dope and maybe make a promise and then break the promise, but there's no end to this war until Putin is no longer there. And therefore, Trump's decision, and it's not quite a final decision, but I think we can pretty much conclude that he's no longer going to support Ukraine. It only increases Putin's desire to be aggressing, and if anything, Putin will become more aggressive. And we've seen that in answer to your question about the overnight bombings and so on. That's not the behavior of somebody who's feeling under pressure. That's not the behavior of somebody who wants to have peace. That's the behavior of somebody who wants to win. And I should also say that from the very beginning until now, Putin has not deviated in one iota his demands on Ukraine. They're completely the same, maximalist demands. So I don't know what they're going to discuss in Saudi Arabia on Sunday, but they're not going to be discussing a material ceasefire from the Russian side, which is the end of the war if they were to do that.
If I could jump in,
Yeah.
I want to say that to me brings a lot of moral clarity here, which is that if you're facing a dictator with maximalist ambitions, only checking his power to wage the war can create the check and balance that you could horse trade. Stephanie, I'd love to pick up some of your insights as a journalist on what the situation is. Maybe how has it changed militarily, financially in the last 2 or 3 months since Trump has come in?
I agree with what Bill said. I don't think Putin is interested in any real peace. I think his goals for controlling Ukraine remain the same. And the negotiations that have happened in Saudi Arabia and that will continue next week, I think one of my biggest concerns is that there's a mismatch in the negotiating teams. Putin has sent his wiliest negotiators, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, Yuri Ushakov, his foreign policy advisor, Kirill Dmitriev, who's, Ivy League educated financier. They're up against Mike Waltz, who's a Florida congressman, and with not a very long term, Marco Rubio, little Marco, and Steve Witkoff, Trump's real estate buddy from New York, and they're kind of approaching it like it's a New York real estate deal. Like, we'll take that nuclear power plant and we'll have some mines, and we're good to go. Who needs security guarantees? There's no one on the U.S. side that really understands Russia. There's no Fiona Hill. There's no one who can kind of read the room and understand what they're really talking about. I mean, I don't think Putin will stick to any deal. And I think he has already achieved his broad goals of dividing the transatlantic alliance, dividing NATO. And I think he's going to push hard to, persuade Trump to force elections in Ukraine so that Zelensky is replaced, because that is Putin's ultimate goal here. He wants Zelensky out, and it looks like Trump is perfectly willing to do his bidding. I mean, the tragedy of this is that I've written this whole book on sanctions called Punishing Putin, and looking at what worked and what didn't, why it was the rollout was too slow to really hit Russia's ability to finance the war. They didn't go after Russian oil, et cetera. But I think that there were real pressures building up in the Russian economy, and sanctions were finally beginning to bite. And then Trump gets elected. And you look at what's happened, just look at what's happened to the Russian ruble since January 20th. It's strengthened by about 40%. So essentially, Trump is bailing out Putin at this very crucial moment. It's hard to predict, what would happen with the Russian economy. It's very opaque. They've pulled a lot of economic data, but there's no doubt that Russia was facing real headwinds economically. with its ability to sustain the war. And even in the first 2 months of the year, they've been spending so much. The deficit is something like 2.7 trillion rubles for the first 2 months, which is more than double what it was projected to be for the year. Putin needs to keep the war going because that is the Russian economy right now. It is a wartime economy. That's one of the other reasons why he needs to keep this going, because if it stops, that's going to, create all sorts of social and political problems from at home. Demobilized soldiers coming back from the front. And if there's any pullback in defense spending, what happens to all those enterprises that have been keeping the Russian regions afloat?
I think we got a lot of interesting context there, which is that the Russians were actually weakening throughout 2024, both militarily in Kursk and financially in the things that Stephanie talked about. And what we've seen is militarily, they're now able to make gains, and financially, the pressure is off. So where does this leave us in terms of the actual discussions about the ceasefire? There's been this question about energy infrastructure. Is there going to be like a tiny carve out that there can be a ceasefire which isn't about all fighting and maybe not in Donbass, but quote unquote, no attacks on energy infrastructure? Is that possible? Does that make any sense? Because that's what we are hearing in the news.
I mean, I think Putin agreed to that, even though Russia has continued to attack Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Be clear that he may have agreed to it in a phone call with Trump, and that's not happened on the ground. It was actually in his interest because the attacks on energy infrastructure in Ukraine now are not as effective if the winter is coming to an end. And actually, Ukrainian attacks on Russian energy infrastructure, namely refineries, has been very deeply damaging to Russia. And so that's a win-win for Putin.
It seems clear to me that the Trump administration's proposals, ceasefire, peace negotiations, have strengthened Putin and weakened the Ukrainian hand, as you have clearly pointed out. But is there a possibility that if Putin is seen to reject things that are even partially in his interest, that the Trump administration or some Republicans could tire of him and be like, wait, Zelensky actually did the thing, and you said no? I mean, is that feasible?
Well, we're kind of living in an Orwellian world right now. I mean, if you take a step back and you do a survey in America of what does the American population think of Vladimir Putin, something like 92% of them think he's a bad guy, and a majority of Americans think that Zelensky is a good guy, and that Russia is the aggressor and Ukraine is the victim. And if you were to take that same survey and you go inside the Republican Party, within the House of Representatives and the Senate, with the exception of Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, and a few other crazies, they all have the same position. And so Trump is not acting in the American, he's not representing the American interest. He's going against the American interest.
The way that I would analyze and extract from what we've just heard from Bill is there is no coherent approach of strengthening American interests via these negotiations.
But there is. So it's all very coherent. It's just you're not looking at it. You don't have all the information.
It's coherent to disorder.
No, it's coherent because it's not about, I'm not sure if it's about order or disorder. I think that Trump has got some other interests that are different than the interests of the American people. And because nobody behaves irrationally.
I don't think it's irrational. I think that neopopulists in general have concluded a world with a lot of wars and market fluctuations and tariff barriers causing the economy to crash and pendulums to swing is one where people are afraid and they can get elected. I don't think that part is not irrational.
But I don't think that this is all chaotic either. I think he's got a very clear sense of what he wants to do. Donald Trump, for reasons that are hard to explain here, favors Putin and disfavors Zelensky.
Well, that seems very clear. Also because Zelensky didn't give him the dirt on Hunter Biden that he wanted. And the first time he was impeached was over that affair. And one thing we know about the Donald, he forgives no one and he believes revenge is a positive principle. So he's trying to exact that revenge.
Yeah, but he forgave Marco Rubio, little Marco, There's actually plenty of people he forgives if they serve his JD Vance, a good example. JD Vance, I mean, those clips of JD Vance calling him a Nazi. I mean, there you go. So I think that there's something more to it.
Okay, well,
I actually think that there is a theory that tries to make the Trump doctrine coherent. I think on one level, he just wants the Nobel Peace Prize and wants a quick deal. I think on the sort of bromance with Putin, I think he sees Putin as a sort of fellow autocratic leader, admires him as an autocratic leader. And there's a strain of the American right that admires Russia because Putin has cracked down on woke ideology and alleges to stand for sort of Christian values. But I actually think what Trump is doing is kind of almost like playing a real life game of Risk, which I think is probably going to fail, which is, and Steve Bannon explains the thinking behind this in the most interesting and clear way. And, Bannon's whole theory is that this is all about hemispheric defense, that actually what Trump wants to do is divide the world up into spheres of influence. Trump wants to sort of control the Western Hemisphere, which is Panama Canal, Greenland, Canada, and then the Arctic will be the sort of great game of the 21st century. And as part of that, they want to do a sort of U.S.-Russia, pact, whereby, in Bannon's view, they share Judeo-Christian values, something that China does not, and that actually the real threat is China. And that Trump, or the people behind him, I don't give Trump that much credit in terms of the thinking behind it, but that he's going to try to pull off a reverse Nixon. There's that camp around him that views China as the real threat. And I think Trump thinks that he can peel Putin away from Xi and get Putin to help him renegotiate the Iran nuclear deal, and that actually Ukraine is just a sideshow as part of all that. And I think that will fail because I think Russia is now too economically dependent on China to turn on it, on its no limits partnership with Beijing. It's sells oil to China. It relies on China for shipments of semiconductors and microelectronics for its defense industry. And I think Putin's ability to turn Iran, is also doesn't look very strong because Russia is relying on Iran for missiles and drone technology. So I think that's he's trying to pull off this sort of grand shift that I think probably won't work.
Let's pivot now to some discussions of sanctions. So I'd like to start with you, Stephanie. Where are we? What aspects of the Biden approach and the OFAC approach have worked? And historically, what have we learned about how sanctions can be used as a lever in a carrot and stick approach? In other words, is anything cultivated that it's like, oh, if we remove these, if you don't violate this ceasefire line, are we able, given the way the sanctions have played out, to horse trade with the Russians? Whether or not Trump wants to, he may not want to because he's his buddy. But if he wanted to, is the sanction something that could be used in a coherent European-American attempt to try to end the war?
Well, I think the sanctions obviously could be used as very effective leverage in any kind of negotiations on the end of the war. There's no doubt about that. It does not look like that is what Trump is planning to do. I mean, there's been a lot of debate, does the sanctions work or not? My view is that obviously they didn't work to the degree that Russian troops are still in Ukraine, but they were effective in costing Russia hundreds of billions of dollars, and Putin desperately wants them lifted. If they weren't working, if they weren't having any effect, it wouldn't be a central demand of Putin during the negotiations to lift them. In my most optimistic scenario, I thought Trump could have at least threatened to ramp up sanctions on Russia to really extract concessions from Putin. That seems to be not the route he's taking at all. On the contrary, he's talking about economic cooperation between the U.S. and Russia, going way further than just lifting of partial sanctions. I think the biggest thing holding back the effectiveness of sanctions. And I think, Bill, you've said this before. We share the same view on this, which is that they didn't hit Russian oil hard enough. And oil is key to the Russian economy. It is how Putin has funded the war. Oil and gas revenues account for about a third of the Russian budget. But Russia is a major oil exporter. It accounts for like 10% of global production. So if you take Russian oil off the market, and I spoke to lots of Biden administration officials for my book, that'll cause the price of oil to go up. And that has been the thing holding back a more forceful sanctions campaign. I mean, there was Biden's fear of escalation, which was misplaced, but also his worry about spiking gas prices in the U.S. ahead of the presidential election, which was a valid concern given how the election turned out. I still think, there is a possibility. There is one route, and I don't want to close that down, where Trump gets really frustrated with Putin and does try to ramp up sanctions. He doesn't seem to care about the costs, unlike Biden. Biden was so worried about prices at home. Trump is threatening tariffs and tanking the markets. So he probably wouldn't care about, what higher oil prices. And there is a path to really ramping up sanctions on oil, particularly with global oil markets softening.
We're certainly going to pivot to what can be done later, but looking backward, what have the Europeans done differently than the Americans, and has there any of it worked?
Well, I think it's good you mentioned the Europeans, because this whole conversation has been about Trump, as if he's the sole determinant of the outcome of this war. And actually, there's two other major players. There's the Ukrainians, who are probably the most important player. They're the ones being invaded, and even if they were completely abandoned by all of us, they would still fight for their freedom. Because what happens if they don't fight? We saw that in Bucha. The women were all gang raped. The men were tortured. Their hands were tied behind their backs, and they were shot in the back of the head and then buried in shallow graves. And the children were kidnapped and sent off to the interior of Russia. So that's the vision that Ukrainians have of Russian occupation. And so if you're a Ukrainian, no matter how tired you are, you're going to fight, and you're going to fight like hell as long as it takes, because the alternative is much worse. Now, the other thing is, if for some reason Putin were to succeed in Ukraine, and he's not going to succeed in Ukraine, at the current pace of acquisition of Ukrainian territory, it would take them 150 years to succeed in Ukraine. But let's just say that somehow it all accelerated and Ukrainian defenses collapsed and he gets it. He's not stopping with Ukraine. You can look at my analysis of this little kleptocrat who's afraid of his own people and needs a war, or you can just listen to what Vladimir Putin says himself. He's not going to stop with Ukraine. He doesn't think that any of these countries, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, any of these countries should be outside of Russia. And so he will carry on, which comes to Europe. We have in Europe, and I'm going to include the UK and Europe for the purpose of this argument, we have an immense national security interest in him not attacking other European countries. And by the way, today, according to Ukrainian estimates, the Russians lost 1,500 soldiers today, and yesterday, and the day before.
And let me jump in. I heard that the 1 million casualty mark has been reached. That whether or not it's 200,000 or 300,000 that have been killed, 1 million Russians have either been killed or invalided out of the war, and that's in a country of ever-decreasing population with an ever-decreasing youth. I mean, it's unbelievable.
So let's just say that Putin makes it through Ukraine and starts attacking Europe, and he's ready to lose 1,000 or 1,500 soldiers a day. Are we? And by the way, I mean, our leaders right now understand this. When the new German chancellor stepped in, he organized a $1 trillion increase in their defense spending to deal with this.
And in fact, the Zeitenwende that was announced by Olaf Scholz about 3 years ago has played out as like a joke, whereas Merz has really changed the way that Germany finances and allows it to do Keynesian deficit spending. So there's reason to believe that it may actually work.
And then we have Keir Starmer, who went from 2% to 2.5%, going up to 3%. Now, of course, that's way too little if we're faced with a Russian attack. And so Europe is fully in this game to help Ukraine because it's in our dramatic national security, European national security interest to do something about this, which leads me to believe that Trump can do whatever he wants with Putin in Saudi Arabia, and they're going to have all sorts of discussions about all sorts of issues that have nothing to do with the ceasefire. What Putin wants is to have negotiations which lead to little gifts, little diplomatic gifts from America, so eventually things are totally normalized. But Europe and Ukraine have huge agency in this whole thing, and whatever is agreed by Trump and Putin, if it's not in the interest of Ukraine and it's not in the interest of Europe, it's not going to be feasible and it's not going to end up happening.
Couldn't agree more. Stephanie, one last point to kind of set the table where we're at on sanctions. Could you tell us what the current state of play on the oil price cap is, the Russian shadow fleet, and has anything changed from the end of the Biden administration to where we are today on March 21st with how Russian oil interacts with the global economy?
Right. So after Kamala Harris lost the election and Trump was elected, I was expecting the Biden administration I knew that they wanted to roll out tougher sanctions on Russian oil. And I kept waiting and waiting. And it took them until January, 10 days before Biden walked out of the White House, to roll out this tougher package of sanctions on Russian oil. They imposed sanctions on about 180 vessels as part of Russia's shadow fleet, imposed sanctions on 2 major Russian oil producers. I thought that this would have been rolled out earlier, but people told me that actually some people inside the Biden administration were worried about what would be the price of gasoline on Biden's last day in office. So that's where we're at in terms of thinking about it. I mean, the price cap, in case you don't know what it is, but it's basically G7 deal that banned Western insurance and shipping services to tankers that were carrying Russian oil above $60 a barrel. It was designed to keep Russian oil on the market, but drive down Russia's revenues. So a series of sanctions have been rolled out to try to target this shadow fleet that emerged to try to, transport oil to China and India outside the price cap coalition. They knew which vessels were doing this. It's all there to see from satellite data. It's not difficult. So they could have gone further on some of these shadow fleet tankers. I still think there are probably another 100 that could be targeted quite effectively, but they haven't. One of the weird things that the Trump administration did do is it allowed this license that was given to Russian banks to accept payments for Russian energy exports. They allowed that license to lapse, which I think is putting a lot of pressure on Russia. It's making it harder for them to earn hard currency in US dollars. But they didn't announce it. They just quietly let it expire, which kind of goes against the very notion of economic warfare. Like you communicate these sanctions as a tool of diplomacy to try to sort of bring about behavior change or send a message. And whether or not there were messages sent behind the scenes remains to be seen, but there is some appetite within at least some corners of the Trump administration to tighten the screws quietly.
Well, I think that Stephanie and Bill have done a great job setting the table of where we are at militarily, diplomatically, on sanctions. What I'd like to contribute is how I see this playing into the global enduring disorder. My 80,000-foot context is that the Western approach towards Russia and the Ukraine war in general, it really epitomizes the enduring disorder. From 2014, with Obama not invoking the Budapest Memorandum when Crimea was annexed, to then Trump doing some things, but also giving javelins, to then threatening to not give them, to Biden doing some things, but not giving all the weapons that he was going to give up front so that they might win, and giving more things later, to now Trump at some point saying that he's going to do more sanctions, but then, ambushing Zelensky in the Oval Office. It's lurching backward and forward, and no European country has stepped up to particularly lead and coordinate. We've seen Macron and Kier do more than they had before as conveners, but post-February 2022, weapons deliveries and sanctions were unveiled, but not in a way that would maximize their impact. The West has done, to my mind, a horrible job of using its economic and military strength to bluff and wrong foot Russia. And this showcases the principle of the enduring disorder, which is that orderers face coordination failures and they lack political will, and they end up with suboptimal courses of action, whereas disorderers frequently punch above their weight. So this leads us to move into the final segment. What can be done to order the disorder? What can the forces of good, my superheroes, Mark Carney and Sir Keir and their advisors, what can they do to order the disorder? So, Bill, you've been on the forefront of the campaign to seize Russia's central bank reserves and use those frozen assets, mostly in Euroclear in Belgium, to fund Ukrainian defense. Tell us more about how is this proceeding? How can this proceed? What can be done on this front?
So, war ultimately is about resources. Ukraine didn't have the resources. Russia had 10 times as many tanks, etc. And we all thought that Ukraine was going to lose the war very quickly. The CIA said 3 days, etc. And because of Ukrainian bravery and because of Western cooperation, we evened the balance so that Ukraine didn't have the same resources as Russia. And coming back to the Biden administration, Jake Sullivan was very explicit. He wanted to give the Ukrainians enough so they didn't lose, but not enough, not so much that they won. But Ukraine got the resources to hold the Russians back, and 3 days turned into 3 years and 2 months. Based on the current resources, it would take 150 years for Russia to get all of Ukraine. Of course, based on the economic problems that Stephanie was just describing, that they don't have 150 years. I don't think they have even 1 year. But now we have this new problem, which is that Trump has stepped in, and he stepped in, and he wants to end the war in 24 hours or whatever he said. And the only way that he can end the war very quickly, since Putin is not going to do anything different, is to get Ukraine to surrender. That's been basically, if you look at it in really simple terms, that's what it's all about, is Trump forcing Ukraine to surrender. And of course, that's why he got so mad in the Oval Office, because Ukraine's not wanting to surrender. Who is this guy not wanting to surrender? And so Trump's only leverage, and he's used the leverage already, is to cut off military aid for Ukraine. After the Oval Office, he cut off military aid, and then they cut off intelligence aid. And military aid, the Ukrainians have a stockpile so they can last a while, but the intelligence, the U.S. has more satellites than all other countries, spy satellites than all other countries combined. And without the eyes and ears of the U.S., like within minutes, the Ukrainians started to really suffer. And so the American support is quite important for Ukraine. And the threat of cutting it off, or the reality and then putting it back on, but knowing that it's probably going to get cut off, based on the risk that we all have here in Europe about Ukraine losing, we've got to figure out a way around this. And so U.S. supplies 40% of Ukraine's military support. Europe and the rest of the world supply 60%. 40%, in theory, is going to disappear. So what do? There's really two simple choices. We're not going to abandon Ukraine. We're definitely not going to do that. And so the only two choices are, we either dramatically increase the burden on the taxpayer of the UK, Germany, France, to, let's say, a 2 percentage point increase in general taxes for the population. You think that's going to be popular? Or the other option is that we froze $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves at the beginning of the war. It's sitting in our custody meaning UK, Europe, etc. Not, by the way, the U.S. Only $5 billion sits in the U.S. And we could just confiscate that money. I mean, it's kind of the simplest, most obvious thing I've ever seen. There is a legal argument for confiscating the money because of the $1 trillion of damage to Ukraine. There's the moral argument, which is that Putin should pay for it. And there's the financial argument, which is why should we, the taxpayers, pay for it when Putin should pay for it? And that's the argument that I've made over the course of 3 years to government officials and to members of parliaments around the world. And at first, everyone thought it was completely outrageous. No, we can't do that. It's never been done. It's unprecedented. And then as time has elapsed and the war has carried on, people are starting to say, well, maybe we should do something. And then we came up with this ridiculous half measure, which is we should take the interest on that money, but not the principal. And everyone thought, yeah, that's a really good idea. And so now we're taking the interest on that money, but not the principal. And then there's one huge problem here, which is that every 6 months, most of the money sits in Europe. It sits in Brussels. And every 6 months, the European Union has to reapprove their sanctions. And it would seem pretty straightforward that they would do that, except for one big problem, which is that when I say the European Union has to do it, what I mean is that 27 member states of the European Union have to unanimously come to the decision to do that. And there's a fly in the ointment. And that fly is Viktor Orban from Hungary. He's Putin's man inside the EU. And he's done a lot of stuff to make life really difficult for our policy against Russia, EU policy, I should say, not the British policy. We're not in the EU. But he's kind of held back his worst instincts because it was out of sync with the rest of the world. Now we've got Trump there, and it's my belief that in July, when the next vote comes, he'll vote against the sanctions. And if he does, then the money gets returned to Russia. And so there's two possibilities. Either we take the money now and use it so that Ukraine can support themselves, or Russia gets the money, and then they have all sorts of extra money coming back to and they're no longer on their knees from all this economic stuff. And then we're really in trouble. And so it seems to me that there's both the moral, political, financial, and time argument to do this. And I think it's actually going to happen, even though some news today say the Belgian government said that would be a declaration of war. Well, guess what? We're at war.
You've made the case extremely clearly, not only tonight, but in many articles and media appearances. And obviously, I couldn't agree more. I'm completely convinced. So, Stephanie, you literally wrote the book about sanctions on Russia. What's worked, what hasn't. And if I could condense this really great book, it's that the sanctions were rolled out too slowly to have maximum impact. What held the G7 back from a more forceful response? And given that the U.S. has signaled that it can't really be counted on to pressure Russia, could we have something like a G6, meaning Europe, Japan, and Canada? And can they step up economic pressure themselves? Because what we are all finding out is that militarily, what do you know? The British nuclear deterrent may be independent, but the missiles it flies on are made in America. Are there financial things that are not yet done that this G6, Carney and co., that they can do on their own?
Yeah, I think there is. Just to echo what Bill said on the central bank assets, which I write about in my book, both the dramatic decision to freeze those reserves in a few days after the full-scale invasion and the kind of deliberations behind the scenes, which many people think that was the real Rubicon that was crossed, not actually confiscating them. Just the act of freezing them was actually the real moment where you cross the line. And then the debate about whether or not to go to the next step. And I think most people thought we would have, some of the people working on it thought we would have already reached this decision to confiscate by now. It's already dragged on for far too long. And I think debates about whether or not it's under war reparations or countermeasures, the Germans are against any war reparations claim because of obvious reasons that they might be targeted. On the sanctions, one of the big successes of the sanctions was how the G7 worked together. And, for all my criticism of them not moving fast enough, there was a lot of coordination between the US, Europe, and the UK, and they worked together, and they set up all these international working groups to really tackle sanctions evasion and look at Russian sanctioned assets, to trace them, export controls to deny Russia access to semiconductors it needs for its defense industry. And what we're hearing now is that actually the Trump administration is either not sending anyone to those meetings or is sending very junior officials. So that era is now over. But I do see a scenario. I don't think there's appetite in Europe to lift sanctions. I tend to think that they will find a way to bribe Orban to get on board yet again. Maybe I'm too optimistic. So I think the EU and the UK will continue with sanctions, and I think most multinational companies won't want to do business in Russia because it's a compliance nightmare. Why they have exposure in Europe, they have exposure in the UK, so I think keeping the EU and UK sanctions in place is an effective deterrent. And remember, Russia has more trade with Europe than it has with the United States. So in terms of
course, particularly on energy.
Energy, but just overall, the effect of lifting EU sanctions will be far more beneficial to Putin than, in many ways, the U.S. sanctions. I think he's looking for lifting of sanctions on oil to really
one way to
get some relief.
What Trump said is actually Europe has all the cards, and it's one of the things that has struck me since really the beginning is that, well, Europe has Euroclear, and that's where the money sits, so that's a pretty important card. They have the geographic card, which is that the arms deliveries go through Europe, and then they have the trade card. So I feel like we've hit on something that Putin is in a much weaker position than is traditionally understood, and certainly as at November of last year, he was in the weakest position he had been in. We're trying to order the disorder here. Any silver bullets for European policymakers that they can push that doesn't require buy-in from the White House?
Unfortunately, I think that game is very difficult to play now with the divisions across the Atlantic. I think that you're right that Putin is trying to present the Russian economy as much stronger than it actually is. And I think the big mistake is people look at GDP and that the economy is growing, but it's really a mistake to look at that in a wartime economy. That's, you look at other measures that Russian inflation is 10%, interest rates are 21%. Those are not healthy signs of a healthy economy by any measure, but he is presenting Russia as having, been strengthened by the sanctions and, been able to develop domestic industry to replace it. But in reality, the sanctions have caused inflation to persist despite all the central bank's efforts to counteract that. I think the only thing they can do is really go after Russian oil, like hit Rosneft, state-controlled Rosneft, the state-controlled oil giant, hit it with full blocking sanctions, and sanction another 100 tankers. But that's going to really require the U.S. to be on board. I don't think, Europe could do the same, but I don't think it would pack the same punch. And so I think on that front, I think it's going to be really difficult to undermine his ability to finance the war.
Well, that was a very candid and clear answer. I propose that we take a minute each to kind of wrap up our thoughts. I'm going to throw out some questions about things that could be done. I want to hear your last comments, and then we'll take 20 or 25 minutes of listener questions, which should be really fun. So here are my thoughts. Is it possible that Trump is a genius deal maker and that the U.S. could lift sanctions and U.S. businesses can return to Russia, and he's cultivating some long game of having more carrots and sticks, and then he'll withdraw those and put more pressure on? I don't think that's possible. I know Bill doesn't think it's possible, but is it possible? So that's just the thought. And then if the U.S. really abandons Ukraine and unsanctions Russia, who is going to lead? Like, I talk about Carney and co., but I really think that there's a huge opportunity, and this is the mega orderer in me. We've seen that Keir does not captivate the British public in PMQs and as a leader on domestic policy issues. And Rachel Reeves has kind of tanked with her opinion polling. But just like when Boris would go to Kyiv, he would get like a little boost in his polling. It seems bizarrely because Keir, if you look at his biography, he's someone who's very domestically focused. He seems actually really good at foreign policy. He did the best Oval Office meeting. He did better than Macron. Obviously, he did better than Zelensky. He played the game. So I'm just wondering, I'm just tossing this out into the ether. It does seem that he's increasingly embattled here, but maybe he's going to be like a great foreign policy PM. So could he all of a sudden say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to have some mega jamboree conference. Carney and I are hosting everyone. If you want to come, you've got to promise a few billion. That's the price. And we'll even let the South Koreans and Japanese come if they promise a few billion. So those are my thoughts, and I'd love to hear yours before we go to Q&A.
Well, you remember when Trump said we're going to build that wall and the Mexicans are going to pay for it? Well, there was no wall and the Mexicans didn't pay for it. Trump said he's going to end the war in 24 hours with Ukraine. There's going to be a ceasefire and, because he's president. I think the war is going to carry on. Sadly, I think the war is going to carry on. The Ukrainians are desperate to stop being bombed and so on. But I think we're going to be sitting here a year from now. The war is going to be carrying on. These are complex issues. The war didn't start in February of 2022. The war started in 2014. People say, how can the war go on for so long? These wars go on for a long time. I mean, if you look,
Afghanistan was 20 years.
Yeah. If you look at the Vietnam War, it started even before Vietnam and it went on for decades. It's a horrible war. And it would be nice if it was over. And the only way it will end is if we give the Ukrainians the tools to end it, because Putin's not going to end it. And it's going to end by force. Putin will only negotiate when a boot is on his throat. And when there's no other option but to negotiate. And we're so far away from that right now. And so I don't think there was going to be an end to this war. I don't think that Trump has that much say in the matter.
Well, there's a lot of moral clarity. And sadly, I think that this analysis, as depressing as it sounds, rings very, very true to all who hear it.
So two things. On the Keir Starmer as the great diplomat, I think, the king is obviously his trump card. And I think the other person helping him is Jonathan Powell, who advised Tony Blair.
Friend of the Disorder podcast.
On the Northern Ireland peace talk. So I think he's played an important role. I mean, the thing that worries me is that, the problem is Russia sees war on a continuum. So there's the kinetic war in Ukraine, and then there's the disinformation war, and then there's the sort of hybrid warfare attacks. And you've seen the cutting of cables in the Baltic Sea, the fires at various ammunition depots, the assassination plots, the spy rings, and that we in the West, we just compartmentalize it. We're too used to just dealing with the military war and then the economic war, and whereas the Russians view this as one large continuum, and with Europe sort of resisting this effort by Trump to do a deal, I think he's only going to step up that hybrid warfare campaign in Europe. And I think that's what worries me. It's the stealth war that I'm most concerned with.
After the break, we're back at the Frontline Club for many, many listeners' questions. Oh my, was I thrilled at all the hands that went up. Come hear them after the break.
Subtle results, still you, but with fewer lines. Botox Cosmetic, onabotulinum-toxin-A, is a prescription medicine used to temporarily make moderate to severe frown lines, crow's feet, and forehead lines look better in adults.
Effects of Botox Cosmetic may spread hours to weeks after injection, causing serious symptoms. Alert your doctor right away as difficulty swallowing, speaking, breathing, eye problems, or muscle weakness may be a sign of a life-threatening condition. Patients with these conditions before injection are at highest risk. Don't receive Botox Cosmetic if you have a skin infection. Side effects may include allergic reactions, injection site pain, headache, eyebrow and eyelid drooping, and eyelid swelling. Allergic reactions can include rash, welts, asthma symptoms, and dizziness. Tell your doctor about medical history, muscle or nerve conditions including ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, myasthenia gravis, or Lambert-Eaton syndrome, and medications, including botulinum toxins, as these may increase the risk of serious side effects. For full safety information, visit BotoxCosmetic.com or call 877-351-0300.
See for yourself at BotoxCosmetic.com.
This episode is brought to you by Bluehost. You might not be a tech genius, but you want the website for your business to crush it. Thankfully, Bluehost makes it easy. Customized, optimized, and monetized. Everything exactly how you want with AI. Your site can be up within minutes, and the search engine tools even help you get more site visitors. Whatever your passion project is, set it up with Bluehost. With their 30-day money-back guarantee, what have you got to lose? Head to Bluehost.com to start now.
Last week was our first playoff game, and my plaque psoriasis was so itchy under all my gear. Sometimes just thinking about scratching could take me out of the moment. And then my doctor told me I could get clearer skin with a pill called Otezla.
Otezla apremilast is a prescription medicine used to treat adult patients with plaque psoriasis for whom phototherapy or systemic therapy is appropriate. Otezla can help you get clearer skin after just 4 months.
Okay, ready for the next game. Talking to my doctor about a pill was a total game changer.
Don't use Otezla if you're allergic to it. Get medical help right away if you have trouble breathing or swallowing, swelling of the face, lips, tongue, throat, or arms. Severe diarrhea, nausea or vomiting, depression, suicidal thoughts, or weight loss can happen. Tell your doctor if any of these occur and if you have a history of depression or suicidal thoughts. Live in the moment. Ask your doctor about Otezla. Call 1-844-4-OTEZLA or visit Otezla.com for prescribing info about cost, and more.
I'd love to hear you first, sir. Please say your name.
Hello, I'm Luke Marchand. So first off, point of order on Carney and Keir. I'm a Canadian myself. Carney has to look at a situation where it is quite likely America will launch the special military operation against cartels or the special military operation against Alberta. That's where it's a province in Canada, whatever. In the next few years. And Keir won that victory in the Oval Office by not backing up Canada, not challenging Trump on Zelensky. Every time he has been forced to stand up to the Americans substantively, he has punted to preserve the special relationship. So can Europe count on leadership from Carney, who will be distracted with things at home, and Keir, who's proven willing to prioritize the Americans even over far older alliances? Worth a thought. And secondly, I think it's worth considering the turmoil we've seen in the American markets, the reductions on the Dow. It's fallen like faster than I've seen it in a long time. There's no inkling that will stop, that they'll reverse policy. How does an American collapse or an economic collapse in the United States influence all of this? Because the Russians want access to the U.S. market. How does that change things?
Hi, Ian Stewart. Question for Bill. Should Europe prioritise the defence spending for Ukraine or domestic rearmament? What comes first now the money is starting to flow?
And we'll take them in bunches of threes. Someone else, right here, this lady. Say your name and your affiliation.
I'm Rosalind Stewart. I'm actually his wife. But my question is very brief. Do you think that the corruption that we've explained so well in Russia is also affecting its army? And I've heard from other people that Russia really only has about 12 months and then it collapses. So all Zelensky has to do is wait. What do you guys think?
Why don't I let you take what you would like from it first?
Well, I think the reason why Russia has done so badly in this war is because of the corruption. Every general, every major, where they were selling all the spare parts off the tanks, they were doing all this kind of stuff, and I think that the corruption is the part of the whole system. But I wouldn't be so optimistic about the war ending quickly. I mean, they can. With a level of corruption, with the level of economic uncertainty in Russia, they could carry on, and they just keep on reallocating everything that should go to the people, to the army. This is what North Korea does.
I'll take the Canada and American stock market one first, which is, of course, there are reasons for Keir and Mark Carney to say, we have all these problems at home. We need to deliver these NHS beds. We need to worry about the fact that the tariffs might addle the Canadian economy. There's every reason for orderers the world over to do navel gazing, to not coordinate with each other, and to show the lack of political will that got us into this mess. And Obama and Biden will have a lot to answer for, and they face similar issues. But if the Canadians want to, they can not only use the fact that Carney is more popular now than a Canadian leader has essentially been in our lifetimes, to convene the mega jamboree conference. And the fact that the American economy is tanking may actually make it easier for this G6 to say, you know what, we're going to push back now. And it's becoming more of a fair fight. What I would just accuse Keir and Carney and others is succumbing to small-minded thinking. And my hope is that they will not fail to grasp the magnitude of the moment, as I think many of their predecessors have?
Yeah, so on the Trump market question, there had been this theory of the case that the one limiting factor on Trump would be the markets, that he's kind of like a hedge fund guy. He views his self-value based on his stock market portfolio performance. And that clearly has not proven to be the case. Or if it is the case, he's just willing to let the losses go for longer than we had originally thought. But I do think I don't think he's going to let the entire market collapse. I do think there's going to be a point at which he's going to try to correct, because if the markets continue,
That doesn't mean that he's going to do the right thing. He might
no, I agree.
pump a bunch of money into the system.
Exactly, or take over the Fed.
Let's take three really quickly, these three right here.
Dominic Cameron, I chair various technology companies in London. First of all, thank you to the three of you for a tremendous evening. And Bill, if I may just say thank you for your service. It's just been incredible. The question, just to the 300 billion, the objection from some to releasing that is to do with what would happen to the credibility of the city and the markets, and people would remove all their money and so on. Now, of all people, I imagine you know the people who that concerns. Why is that argument? Why is your argument against that not being made more coherently and more vociferously?
Hi, good evening. I'm a British documentary filmmaker based in Paris. Thank you for tonight. With this minerals deal, even if it's bullshit or not, it's been put on the table as a talking point. And now they're talking about nuclear power plants as well. In terms of dealing with Trump as he is, which is sort of just business and strength and power, etc., I was wondering whether could France, seeing as France and also Britain, etc., with this coalition of the willing, seeing as these guys are putting money on the table, potentially boots on the ground, and potentially extending a nuclear umbrella, could France potentially step in and offer this kind of minerals deal? And if you frame it with Zelensky putting it forward as, this makes business sense for me because he's offering me stuff which you're not, and also frame it in the sense of America saying Europe needs to look after itself, with Britain still acting as this bridge, keeping Trump still at arm's length connected, might that be a better strategic way forward?
Hi, Linda Edwards. I chair the Institute of Economic Affairs. And so I'm curious because, most economists would tell you that sanctions don't work. I've visited North Korea and Cuba and Syria and Iran during their time of sanctions. And sanctions generally, they disproportionately hurt the population and empower the leaders to stay in place. And so I think the Magnitsky idea is great, where you sanction targeted people, except now, the kleptocrats in Russia have a problem of falling to their deaths out of hotel windows if they oppose. But the idea of taking the money, and then the other thing is sanctions are often used as virtue signaling that we're against this, and it's seen as an alternative war to hot war, but we're in a hot war. So it seems like we should really be focusing on getting the 300 billion to people and getting them the equipment they need. We've already crossed the Rubicon. So, do you see any way in which the sanctions are going to make an actual difference?
So apparently the Saudis, I don't know who put them up to it, called up the Christine Lagarde at the European Central Bank and said, we're going to pull all of our money out of France and out of Europe if you confiscate the central bank reserves. And she panicked and said, this is terrible. We should never do this. It would destroy the credibility of the euro. But the reality is, where are the Saudis going to put their money? If you've got a whole multi-billion-dollar accumulation of money, you're going to put some of that money in dollars, you're going to put some of that money in euros, maybe a little bit of sterling. You're not going to put that money in Argentina, you're not going to put that money in Iran, you're not going to put that money in Indonesia. You're going to put that money in normal places where there's with reserve currencies, where when your bond matures or whatever, you'll be able to get your money back. And so it's complete nonsense. It's a stupid argument, and it kind of pisses me off, actually, that Christine Lagarde is putting this theoretical argument out there, which is not true. This is going to destabilize the euro, because I'll tell you something. If Ukraine doesn't get the money that they need, there's not going to be a euro. And I don't want my sons and daughters dying on the front because of Christine Lagarde's theoretical argument.
And it comes down to the lack of political will. I mean, that's my answer. My answer here. I think sanctions do work. So I want to just directly confront you. The blanket sanctions on Libya between 1992 and 1999 completely changed Gaddafian behavior. He stopped funding terror. It led to the opening up, the infitah of the regime. The sanctions couldn't have been more effective because everyone followed them. Libyan students couldn't study in Europe. They couldn't go to Africa. It was, of course, only when South Africa began to try to break from those sanctions that you had a crumbling of the coalition. But by then, Gaddafian behavior had already changed. The sanctions worked. So
yeah, I mean, I would say that there are examples. I mean, arguably, the Iran sanctions brought Iran to the negotiating table. I think it's wrong to think of sanctions as regime change. I don't think that that's...
they're not supposed to have been regime change. So, I mean, again, that's really the wrong response.
The embargo on South Africa contributed to the fall of apartheid. I mean, so there are examples of when they have worked. I think the difficulty with Russia, and yes, the Russian population has suffered from higher inflation as a result of sanctions, but Putin has compensated by just showering money on everyone to try to keep everyone bought into the war. I think the problem with Russia is that he doesn't care. He doesn't care if he has 1 million casualties. He doesn't care if he bankrupts the country. And that's part of the reason why the sanctions haven't been as effective of a lever. I agree that actually at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, there wasn't a clearly articulated strategy of what was the goal here. What are we trying to do? I mean, I called my book Punishing Putin, but I don't think it was really about punishment. But I didn't let that get in the way of a good title. Was it about behavior change? I think they very quickly realized it wasn't. These sanctions were not going to change his behavior. So it became about bleeding Putin of the resources to wage war, to try to make it harder for him to finance the war. And in that sense, I think it has, it's hard to prove a counterfactual. You can't definitively say, where would we be if the sanctions weren't in place? I think Russia would be in a much stronger position, no doubt, despite the leakiness and the problems of sanctions.
Of course. I mean, I would say that, in fact, just a study of the military nature of this war would show how effective sanctions are. If they had been rolled out, the oil price caps definitively, very, very quickly, we could have even, attacked their ability to access shipping services. I want to make sure that the gentleman's question is addressed on minerals.
Well, let me go for that one really quickly. So I was the largest foreign investor in the former Soviet Union for 10 years, and I looked at every possible way you could make money or not make money in all the different countries. And there wasn't a single minute in that 10-year period that anyone ever talked to me about rare earth minerals in Ukraine. It's not a thing. He should sign the deal, whatever the deal is, because it's ridiculous. And they can call it $1 trillion deal. There are no rare earth minerals in Ukraine that anyone's going to mine anytime in our lifetime.
I know that we are a little bit constrained on time. We're going to take one more round of 3 questions, and I apologize to people in advance who haven't gotten to ask their question. Let's go to the back, to this nice lady here, and then one other person in the back.
Hi, I'm Irina Pasechnik. Would Putin's death change anything?
Back to the left there, this gentleman on the left.
Hi, Rob Byrne, I'm a journalist. How significant do you think any alleged Russian compromat on Donald Trump is in terms of the actions we're seeing at the moment?
Okay, and then the absolute last question.
Today, Oleg Gordievsky died. He represented a sort of crack in the Soviet Union. Does anyone see any cracks in the Putin regime?
If Putin dies, it all depends on how he dies. If he dies a peaceful death tonight, with a stroke or a heart attack, all the oligarchs will get together in the Kremlin and figure out how to keep the status quo going, because without the status quo, someone's going to try to take away all the money that they stole. If he dies in an uprising with the people, the pitchforks on Red Square, then there's every possibility of a Vladimir Kara-Murza, Ilya Yashin, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, or some mixture of people from the opposition finding their way back to Russia and trying to rebuild it in a normal way. I would say that the vast majority probability, like 90% plus, is status quo, either Putin staying alive and doing the same stuff, or or a replacement Putin, it's a small probability that the opposition wins and or changes Russia. But look at what happened with Syria. I mean, it all happened like in the seconds.
And instead, the opposition is killing Alawites, and we already have the sectarian blowback. So I guess what I would jump in and say is it's going to all get worse before it gets better.
On the question of compromat on Trump, I have spent, you can't even tell you how many hours, how many days researching this. It's quite routine for Russian intelligence to keep a file on prominent foreigners, and there's probably little doubt that there's a file on Donald Trump because of his various visits to Russia, including in 2013 for the Miss Universe pageant. But I spoke to someone recently who claimed to have knowledge of this compromat that they've got on him, but he was unable to provide any additional information to verify it. And I think this is the problem, is even if there is something, Putin wouldn't disclose it, because once he discloses it, it no longer has any value. And on top of it is that if there is some tape, at this point, AI is so good that Trump would just dismiss it as just an AI-generated fake.
So from the sublime to the ridiculous, it's been a pleasure to attempt to order the disorder with my fantastic panelists, Sir Bill Browder and Stephanie Baker. If you enjoyed the Disorder Live show, please follow the link in our show notes to subscribe to the Substack so that you can be invited to the future live shows. In fact, join the paid Substack and get a discount on all future live shows, such as the one we're going to do in May in Whitehall at Russi. If you also want to find out more about Sir Bill Browder's case as to why we should confiscate the frozen Russian assets, we're going to put links to his articles and other media appearances on that topic, and to what Stephanie has written about sanctions. That's all in the show notes and Substack. As always, our producer has been the one, the only, the mega orderer, George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern. I am wishing you an orderly and sanctions-free week.
The political landscape has changed.
The country is changing direction. It's a big moment and a very, very difficult one.
The New Statesman podcast is here to help you understand what's really going on in Westminster and beyond.
I think there's a sense in Downing Street that this is the vision, this is the narrative, this is the plan.
I'm Hannah Barnes. Join me, Andrew Marr, the New Statesman's politics team and political guests every Thursday and Friday. Search The New Statesman in your podcast app now.